You may not have known the details of all that, but you knew the drift of all that before you walked in here. What you need to know now, what can we do about it more than just protest, more than just vote, and people, we vote, and things don't seem to change. Well, what we can do about it is what the founders intended us to do about it. They did give us a check and balance, and they intended for the states to be a check and balance on a runaway federal government. And George Mason, who was an anti-federalist, was worried that the federal government that they were creating the Constitution, not that they were aiming at the wrong things, but that the power that they were constructing wasn't appropriately checked and balanced, and that it would end up someday with the federal government being too big and too powerful and dangerous to our liberties. And he wanted, for instance, a Bill of Rights. And by agitating for that in Virginia, we got the Bill of Rights thanks to the ratification process that happened later in Virginia. And George Mason is known as the father of the Bill of Rights for that reason. Mason didn't like the way Article 5 was originally drafted, because the way it was drafted was this. All constitutional amendments were proposed by Congress. That all constitutional amendments were ratified by the states. Well, that sounds nice and balanced, except for this. Mason said, if you do it that way, the Congress will never propose amendments that will be used to restrict federal power. You've got to have a mechanism to restrict federal power. And we got to give that to the states. So when people say it's dangerous to use Article 5 state power, what they're saying is we can trust Congress to remedy its own abuses of power. Folks, I hate to tell you this, it ain't going to happen. I've been in Washington, D.C. as an activist for 30 years. It isn't going to happen. I don't care if the Republicans are in the White House. I don't care if the Republicans are in the Senate. I don't care if the Republicans control the House of Representatives. When that happens, our slide into the abyss slows down. That's it. We have not changed anything in any of those situations. We slow down the problem. We don't come up with solutions. Because Washington, D.C. is addicted to one thing, the power of Washington, D.C. Everybody is addicted to that power. And institutionally, the founders understood that. And they thought, good men will mess up because they think, they go to Congress and think, I'll do better than the last people. And they will for about 4 weeks. And then Washington, D.C. grabs a hold of most of them. Not all of them. There are a few champions that make it and stand up for what's right on a consistent basis. I'd say there's about 5 in the U.S. Senate, and there's about 20 or 30 in the U.S. House. And it's rare. It's a rare breed, but they're there. But far more people are affected by Washington, D.C. than those who affect Washington, D.C. There's not enough power to do it. But there is enough power in Article 5 and in the states. We can change the rules. And people will say, well, you can't change the rules because they don't obey the Constitution as it's written anyway. How can you fix it? Here's how you fix it. Let's just take the General Welfare Clause. If the General Welfare Clause said Congress can tax and spend for the general welfare of the United States, provided that Congress cannot spend money on any topic for which the states have jurisdictional authority to spend. Now, that's going to be really hard for them to get around. Even Justice Roberts couldn't find a way around that. And for at least 50 to 75 years, they wouldn't figure a way around it. They'd have to obey it for a good long while. And if we buy 50 to 75 years of freedom, we've done a good thing. And that's the worst case scenario. You write it correctly. Treaty power. Let's take that one. The reason that the founders didn't think they were doing anything wrong by giving treaty power supremacy over state law and state constitutions, nobody ever imagined a treaty having the authority to regulate the domestic policy of the United States. In fact, why did we have the Tea Party? It was because we didn't want people in London passing laws for us. Why we would let Geneva or the UN in New York pass laws for us is nuts. Why we would want, Bob Dole has personally criticized me in the national media in the last month for me personally leading the effort to kill the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But not because I don't have a warm spot in my heart and want good laws for people with disabilities. My mom's in a wheelchair. She's had MS for 40 years. I pushed my mom around France in a wheelchair. Europe has a horrible situation for people with disabilities. I just think Americans need to make the law for America. We don't need disability policy made by the UN. And if the U.S. Senate thinks that we need to have disability policy made by the UN, what they're saying is they don't have the competence to pass the laws that Americans need in America. And they ought to think that. They ought to resign their offices and give it up to people who have the competence to pass American laws for American people with disabilities. But I want to do more than just take away defeat them treaty by treaty, which I've done for 20 years. I led the fight to defeat the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which would just destroy parent-child relationships in this country. I've helped on other UN treaties. I filed briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court on this issue. But let me tell you how to fix the problem. You have a phrase to the Constitution that says this: no treaty power may be applied to domestic laws unless such a treaty is ratified by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and by 2/3 of both houses of 38 state legislatures. Which means never. And the reason you wouldn't just say never is because they find a way around of saying, well, it's not really a domestic treaty. No, if you write a procedure in where treaties affecting domestic policy can be ratified, but then you just make it politically impossible for it to happen, you won. That kind of constitutional clarity can do it. So how do we get constitutional language that fixes this? We can fix spending, we can fix debt, we can fix the use of executive orders, we can take away the power of Congress, or excuse me, the legislative branches to give away their power to the executive branch. Obamacare, the rule in Hobby Lobby, that Hobby Lobby litigated, by the way, I'm happy, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that they used, I'm the guy that named it. I was the chairman of the group that wrote it. And so I know how to find solutions to problems and write legislation that works. That case right there will tell you I know how to find solutions that work. The way you do this is you take away their power. You take away their power and you give it back in constitutional language. Congress will never propose these amendments. The states can. How do we get the states to do it? Number one, there are 40 states that are our targets. Now, if other states help, like if California just suddenly comes to its senses and helps, bless God, miracles happen. If Massachusetts comes to its senses, bless God, real big miracles happen. Okay? But there are 40 states that we're aimed at. And in those 40 states, there are 4,000 state house districts. There are 1,300 state senate districts in those 40 states. Now, if you organize state house districts all over the state, by definition, you have people in the same locations as all the state senate districts. So we're just focused on state house districts. Not that we're not going to pay attention to the senators, but that's how our political operation is organized. 4,000 state house districts in 40 states. If we can organize 75% of those districts and have at least 100 people in each of those districts who will do three things: stand up, speak up, and show up, we can pass a convention of states and we can ratify the kind of amendments that I've talked about. I don't want to just call an Article 5 amendments convention. I want to ratify the kind of amendments that we're talking about. And if we don't build the political operation to do that, we're not going to ratify them. We may get it called, you can't get to 34. 34 is not the objective. 38 is the objective.